What I want to do today is go back and take a look at the tier list that I published right before the World Championship, which was on the Friday in between Worlds and the qualifiers, and figure out what I said on the tier list, if I was right or wrong, and if I was wrong, why was I wrong? Because it's important when I'm putting out predictions and tier lists and things like this to go back and check my work and see if I had blind spots, what were they, why did they happen, how can I prevent it in the future? And I think I'm going to start doing this for every large event that happens, like every seasonal. I'll go back and say like, hey, here's what I thought the seasonal meta was going to look like, here's what it actually looked like, and things like that. And the World Championship, obviously a big event, so I want to go back and see how I did on predictions and things of that nature. So there's a lot going on your screen right now. All the way on the left here, we have the tier list from the Tournament Tactician that I put out right before Worlds on Friday, and I have eliminated all of the decks off of it that did not show up at the World Championship, because otherwise we're looking at a cluttered mess of decks that don't matter. Everything that I said would be tier 1 did show up, didn't delete any decks out of there. It was mostly just trimming the fat off of tiers 2 and 3. These are the deck lists from the qualifiers, because I do want to touch on what I predicted going into the qualifiers, and then how the qualifiers affected the final tier list. This is the top 16 from Worlds. This is the top 8 from Worlds. And then over here we have some stats like the ban percent, the wins, the losses. These are color coordinated, so these decks on tops are the ones that made top 8. These ones on the bottom are the one that did not. And that's what we're going to be looking at, is going over the tier list, how the qualifiers impacted the tier list, what I got right, what I got wrong, that kind of stuff. Going into the qualifiers, the one thing that I remember going upstairs and ranting to my roommates about was that I really thought it was going to be a control dominated field in performance, not necessarily by play rate, right? Like, I thought control would do very well, but I did not expect it to be super popular. Like, I thought Anivia was going to do very well. I think I had put that in tier 1. I had put Frostbite midrange in tier 2 or tier 1. I don't actually remember, because it had just performed very well in this anti-Draven Scion lineup, and we all kind of expected Draven Scion to be very popular at the qualifiers. And I think I called out Draven Scion as something that I expected to be very popular at the qualifiers and not do very well. It ended up just not being very popular, but that was what it was. I said that I thought Bandletree was going to be the best deck, because I expected a control-heavy format, and Bandletree does very well into control. It also did very well into Draven Scion, and the one question mark I sort of had was, how does it do into these Lulu Poppy decks, all the rallies that are going around? It turned out that Bandletree was the deck of the event, but not for the reason that I thought it was going to be, and I expected to get some things wrong going into the qualifier once I figured out that Sivir Demacia was much more alive than I thought it was. It was too hard to do guesswork for the tier list, not knowing if Sivir Demacia was going to do well, because I put the video out like a day after the nerfs happened or something like that, so totally understandable that I got that one wrong. I don't expect last-minute balance patches to come out like that again, so hopefully that's a situation I won't be running into in the future. And then, obviously, this is what the qualifiers looked like, and then I use that to determine this tier list. So, things that I got wrong. Draven Scion I put in tier 2. It ended up not only being super popular, but being the most banned deck of the format by a wide margin. The thing that is interesting to me in sort of evaluating this one is that it only had a 50% win rate. It went 6-6 when it was unbanned, but I do weigh a ban presence like this pretty heavily, because it means that people don't want to play against it. And I don't know if the plan was to just ban any Draven deck that you see, regardless of whether it is Draven Scion or Draven Caitlyn, and that is why it had such a high ban presence. But you do see more Draven Scion bans than Draven Caitlyn's, and as you can see here, the presence was pretty similar, right? Like, it was 7 Draven Scion and 6 Draven Caitlyn Ezreal, which means that players were banning Draven Scion a lot more than they were banning Draven Caitlyn. So it wasn't just blanket, we'll ban whatever the PNZ Noxus deck is. It was something specific about Draven Scion, and I think part of this was just players either not expecting it to show up because it had such a dinky performance at the qualifiers, or if it was just like, hey, you know, Scion's the high roll deck. I'm a little surprised that Zoe Nami didn't garner more bans. You know, it was tied with the Draven Caitlyn, but I really am struggling to kind of figure out why Draven Scion was so banned, especially when it had only a 50% win rate, and there weren't really anything that I would call like an anti-Draven Scion lineup running around at Worlds. Nobody was really looking to pick on this deck that was leaving it open and handing it a bunch of losses that sort of skewed the win rate, right? So this is one that I'm going to maybe look into a little bit more, especially because the seasonal is coming up in a couple of weeks. I think it's 3 or 4 weeks away at this point. So we are still existing in this meta. We're not expecting any balance changes in between now and that seasonal. So all of this information still has a very relevant meta use. So this is something that I'm going to be digging more into as we approach the seasonal. I did end up moving Anivia down to tier 3, which is kind of where the Fielder Rush comes in, but I'll talk about that later. Darkness is something that I stood my ground. I said, this is tier 1. It made it all the way to 2nd place at the event. And while it didn't show up in the qualifiers in terms of pushing players into the top 16, it was very present in the players that were just shy of making it. I think every region had at least one player running Darkness that was one win off of making it to Worlds. It happened with Drisoth in the America Shard. I believe lost to Ikato in the upper bracket, and then unfortunately just couldn't make it through the losers run, getting thrown into that Sultan bracket that Realkey qualified through. And overall, I thought that the Darkness deck was just like one of the better Bandle City decks out there. And I was pretty sure that Bandle City was like going to be the deck of the weekend. Minimorph is a very impactful card. Aloof Travelers, Pokey Stick. These are things that players wanted to be bringing. And it made sense to me that Darkness was still going to put up a number at Worlds. I kind of expected more people to swap to it, but I am happy that Yamato was able to stick with it and make it all the way to a 2nd place run. And now Darkness is all over the place on ladder. So I feel pretty good about that one. That one's a win for me. Nami Elusives, I had mentioned, was a deck that I wasn't big on. And I'm not just saying this because it didn't perform well. This is sort of like backing up what I was saying, in that I thought the deck was inconsistent. I didn't really like it. I know that players were super big on it when it dropped, and I was always critical of it in my videos and just being like, hey, you know, it's tier 1. People are going to bring it. It is going to win things, but I do not click with this deck. I do not love it. And it only put up a 43% win rate. It played 23 games, so we have quite a few stats to look at to be like, hey, you know, didn't perform as well as you wanted it to. And part of it was just the inconsistency of the deck. Sometimes it doesn't matter how well you play, your deck just doesn't line up like you need it to. One good example of this, where even if your hands don't line up, you still have very winnable games, is Lee Sin. It's usually a Targon deck that this happens with. Almost always a Zoe deck that this happens with. And in the old Lee Sin builds, not so much the newer Crescendum Eye of the Dragon builds. Those are just like, does Eye of the Dragon solo the deck or does it not? I'm talking about the older builds that ran like Fangs and Solari Priestess and multiple 2-drops because we weren't playing Crescendum, like the Mountain Goat Lee Sin decks. Those had a lot of hands where even if you didn't find Lee Sin, you still had a very winnable game. Nami doesn't feel like it has as many of those hands. Double Trouble is not going to fucking carry you through a game of Legends of Runeterra. It'll wall up a little bit, but it ain't winning you the game, right? An unbuffed Sparklefly is not going to win you the game, and because you don't have as many buffs in the deck outside of the Nami and the Shelly, and even Shelly can't carry you through some games, right? Like, you need Burble Fishes for Shelly to really be impactful, otherwise you're buffing up one Sparklefly every 2 spells. It's not something that's going to happen, and that's where I thought the control was going to do very well, was into the Nami matchup specifically. And we also saw Nami struggle with Sivir Demacia a lot in the qualifiers. I think that was like a very favored matchup for Sivir Demacia, at least what we saw from the qualifiers, so I wasn't big on this deck, and it didn't perform as well as players needed it to. It was sort of the downfall of the Americas. A lot of them ended up bringing this deck, and it bricked for them on the final moments in the top 8. We saw Majin brick on it. We saw Cosimo drop on sort of brick on it, even though he's Europe. You know, same deck, same concept. It just did not show up in day 3 of Worlds, and it had a pretty poor win rate. The one thing that I also did want to mention is that the most played matchup through Worlds was Zoe Nami versus Draven Caitlyn Ezreal. It was only a 3-3, or it was only a match that was played 6 times, not a great sample size. It was a 50% win rate, so 3-3. Doesn't really mean anything, but this is one of those decks that you're going to need to think very carefully about before bringing into the seasonal, because it does have these inherent inconsistencies. I think the deck is pretty solved. I don't expect the builds to change drastically from here on out, and I do still think that it is like the best Nami deck. That one I'm not so sure of. I think that we might find another Nami deck going into the seasonal. We still got like 4 weeks of testing that we can do, but I think Zoe Nami is currently about as good as it's going to get. Lulu Poppy, I don't know shit about this deck. I don't play rally decks. I don't like playing them. They're really hard to evaluate while watching them because, like, sometimes a rally wins you the game and sometimes you just break on rallies. It's a deck I've never been very big on archetype-wise. I thought Bandletree was going to do a little bit better as the Poppy deck, and once again, didn't really understand how the Poppy v Bandletree matchup went, so I just kind of took the safe road, put it in tier 1, said, hey, this is a very good deck. Second most popular deck of the event, tied, of course, with Zoe Nami and Draven Control. And then if we check over the chart here, 50% win rate, 10 and 10. You know, it's a deck that I'm not big on. It's a bit of a blind spot for me. I don't know if that's going to change necessarily because they're hard to evaluate, right? Either you draw the rallies or you don't. One thing that I do remember is that everybody played Bandle City except for Ikato, who brought Ionia. And the Bandle City decks looked pretty varied. I don't remember who it was. It was one of the South American players. Had like a really weird build of Lulu Poppy Bandle City. It might have even been What Am I? and one of the South Americans. You just have like different builds for this. But I think this is a deck that is unrefined. We're going to figure out what actually is the best version, but maybe it doesn't matter, right? Maybe if you just play Poppy and 5 rallies and any other pile of cards, it's expressive enough that you can just run this on your own style. A little bit of a mixed bag here in terms of success, but hey, it's one that we'll keep track of. It's probably going to stay in Tier 1 going into the seasonal. It's a solid choice. You know, you can't really go wrong with it, but it does have the capability to brick out on you, as all Demacia decks do. Bandletree, wherefore art thou, Bandletree? So the only player to bring Bandletree to the World Championship was Ragnarsson, who didn't play it in the qualifiers, didn't even play Poppy in the qualifiers, was the only Lulu Zed player that actually made it through to the top 16. And Bandletree is still something that I'm really big on. I know that players have swapped over to a pretty value-centric game right now, and I think that Control is going to struggle in a situation like that if everyone's just playing Bandle City all over ladder. It's a little bit different in tournaments. There's only so many good Bandle City Mare decks, and I think that Bandletree is one of them. And I would imagine that if we're both playing like these dirtily Bandle City decks where we're both just trying to create like infinite value, yeah, Bandletree should come out on top of that one because I have a win condition and you don't when we're both just sitting here and slamming our 6-wide Loping Telescope boards into each other. So Bandletree is something that I think was underrepresented at the World Championship. I don't know why everybody got so spooked off of it. My best guess is that they expected Draven Caitlyn to continue to rise in popularity, as well as Sivir Demacia. With the Absolver being played in Sivir Demacia now, it actually has a pretty good Bandletree matchup because you can punch through those boards a lot easier. But I'm still big on Bandletree. Maybe the Noxus version isn't the way to go. Maybe the Ravenous Phlox and things like that aren't pairing well into the meta that we're expecting to see, and we will change regions. But I think that it's flexible enough, and we have enough time to figure it out before the seasonal, that Bandletree will have a rise again and take up a pretty decent showing at the seasonal. Then Draven Caitlyn. This one's a gimme. The deck's been around forever. Obviously played, I think, the most games of any deck at the World Championship with 24 and boasted a 58% win rate, so that's pretty good. Whether you want to play Draven Caitlyn or Draven Ezreal, Ikato, once again, the only player showing up with Draven Ezreal, and then Shihu's still playing the 2 Ezreal and the 1 Caitlyn. Those players did both make it to the top 8, which is something to be said. So, like, half of these were more or less Draven Ezreal, not Draven Caitlyn. And we saw the Ezreal do a lot of work for these players. I think that the players need to come together and figure one out because I think that one of these should be more present by the seasonal. We should have figured out whether Draven Caitlyn or Draven Ezreal is the one that does better into the meta. I was big on Draven Caitlyn earlier. I'm really starting to come around to Draven Ezreal, so I'm going to check back with this one on, you know, closer to the seasonal and see if I'm still on the Draven Ezreal train that I've started to come around to. As far as Sivir goes, yeah, the deck has some inconsistencies. Again, it's another Demacia pile that plays like 5 rallies. Not 5, but you get the idea. I think players were usually playing 2 or 3. Sometimes more. Some players did even put in the Relentless Pursuit. It had a really bad conversion rate into the top 8, but it did win the event, so kind of hard to knock that one. Again, we have stats for it, 56% win rate, 9 and 7, which is pretty good, I think, given the low conversion rate that it had into the top 8. Granted, part of this is because, like, Alan won the tournament and he was playing it, so the wins are going to be a little bit inflated, because I don't think it was ever banned throughout the top 8. I don't remember, honestly. Maybe I'll put a little anecdote here when I actually get to check after I'm done filming. But that does like inflate the win rate a little bit. So without Alan winning the tournament with this, if he had lost in the top 8, I think this would actually be like 6 and 7. Just a pretty bad conversion rate. So, you know, we'll see. Sivir Demacia, I think, is going to definitely look more like it did in Worlds than the qualifiers, where here it took almost half of the top 8. Here it was a little bit more of a fringe deck, took less than a third of the tournament. I think that's about the presence that we're going to continue to see it at. So as far as the things that I got right here, I mean, most of Tier 1 is kind of a gimme, right? That's supposed to be the easy stuff. Darkness was the one that I stuck to my guns on, and I'm happy about that. Good job, Boulevard, got that one right. Bandletree is kind of questionable whether or not I got it right. I think that it should have had a higher presence at the World Championship, but again, this is something that I'm going to pay a lot of attention to going into Worlds, but I think with the way, or going into the seasonal, but I think with the way that the meta is shaping up, Bandletree will probably stay in Tier 1, and I was rewarded for my skepticism of Zoe Nami having a poor win rate, so good job there. Draven Caitlyn over Draven Ezreal, I think, is still like a debate. I just kind of tiered one over the other because I didn't want to put them next to each other. I wanted to like take a stand and say, hey, Draven Caitlyn's better, which based on the results it was, but I think that's a pretty minimal thing. This like doesn't really matter that much. Blunder is where the tier list gets a little bit outdated. So you need to understand, Tuesday of the week that that video came out is when GPBC and Shellfolk Ezreal sort of came out. Right, that's when those decks were discovered, they got posted, they started getting spread around. and I had to put the video out Thursday because I was doing fight night, so I didn't have a lot of information on those. I would have put GPBC in tier 2. I would not have put Shellfolk Ezreal anywhere on the tier list. And GPBC performed about as well as I expected it to. I thought that it was going to have a higher presence than Plunder, which, cool, right. Did think it was going to have a higher presence among the LATAM and Brazilian representatives because Jelu is a really big Bilgewater fan. I expected him to be on GPBC. He was. Good job, Jelu. I really thought Kevin LOR was going to swap over to GPBC, but instead did go with Plunder, which is like a respectable choice. GPBC, it had a pretty poor win rate. It really didn't do as well as I expected to, and I think part of that was that we were noticing that the deck lists were a little bit unrefined, which is expected of how late in the game the deck did come out. So it's understandable that it has a 45% win rate. I will give it that. The builds weren't the most refined. I think at least one person from every region ended up bringing it, which again is going to affect the win rate because everyone had a different style of playing it. I think it's going to perform a lot better in the seasonal, but it might fall off before then. We might run into a situation where it's not aggressive enough, or we switch over to the control-y version. I've seen a lot of players playing like Monster Harpoon and things like that, and maybe that just doesn't pair it well enough into the meta. I've got a little bit of a red flag on GPBC right now, where I still think it's pretty good, but I'm not sure it's got longevity. Yeah, GPBC and Plunder, tier 2, solid place to put them. Expect them to fall down a little bit more like low tier 2 decks than like tier 2 decks, right? But I did get that one right. Draven Scion is kind of hard to evaluate because, again, it only put up a 50% win rate, but it was extremely popular. This one maybe should have been tier 1, but I also expected more banditry and more control, which is why this influenced this down to tier 2. Because Draven Scion is a terrible darkness matchup, and it has a pretty bad banditry matchup, and I don't think that's really changed based on the builds that we're seeing of Draven Scion. And with how much we are seeing new dirtily Bandle City decks come out, I think it's going to remain in tier 2 as the presence of Minimorph rises. But for this event, for the World Championship, I stand by placing it in tier 2 because I did think Darkness and Bandletree should have been more popular. It ate a lot of bans, though, and that, like I said earlier, says something. This is another one that I'm going to dig deep in on the World Championship because it is arguable that I got this one wrong. I would call it more right than wrong, but yeah, I could concede that I was wrong on this one. And we'll circle back and take a look at that a little bit later on. Tier 3. Fucking nailed it, buddy. Look at this. TF Swain, tier 3. Because TF Noxus, I meant, it was on the tier list as TF Gangplank / TF Swain. TFGP showed up. How did it do? Boom, 1-1, 50% win rate. Did not make the top 8. TF Swain, boom, 0-6, easily the worst performing deck of the tournament. Pirate Aggro, how did you do? Boom, 2-1, 66% win rate. Only Pin Ping Ho brought it, was unable to convert this into a top 8 finish. And then Discard Aggro, again, in the gutter, 0-3, worst performing Draven deck of the tournament by far. So I got the tier 3 stuff good. Cool, I know what sucks. Awesome. Let's talk about the things that I didn't tier, right? Shen Jarvan flew under the radar a bit for me. I knew that it did well into Sivir Demacia, but I only expected Sivir Demacia to be like a third of the tournament. I didn't like its matchup charts elsewhere. Therefore, take it off the tier list. Did not perform well. Good job, Boulevard. Shellfolk Ezreal. Lack of information. That's going to happen. Went 1-0, ate all the bans. Good job, Alan. Now everybody's playing it. Fuck you, Alan. Feel the rush. So I had put Anivia in tier 3 on the tier list, and I had taken Feel the Rush off completely. After Lissandra got nerfed, I was big on Feel the Rush. I was like, hey, this is the Shadow Isle Freljord control deck that, was just a worse Lissandra at the time. I think it's going to come back really big. It got overshadowed by Anivia, so I was like, okay, nobody's playing Feel the Rush. It's Anivia's time again. And then Anivia just kind of continued to perform worse and worse week after week. So I had moved Anivia down to tier 3. That was like where I put Shadow Isle Freljord control. And then Feel the Rush, obviously she who busted out. It's doing very well. It was an extremely specific meta call, and it was an extremely smart specific meta call. And this is something that players are going to need to look at, and analysts like myself are going to need to look at in the future and say, hey, this is a deck that is a little bit slept on right now. It's a little bit harder for me to find information like that, to find like the sleepers, because obviously I don't play as much Runeterra as a bunch of these players do. I'm not like scrimming as often. But it's one of those things that I need to look out for and try to identify weaknesses in the meta, because like, yeah, how do you answer Feel the Rush as like a Bandletree deck? You just get bodied. There's all these go wide decks. I knew that Avalanche was very well positioned, and I thought that Thralls was the Avalanche deck of the meta. That was in tier 2, so I knew that I liked Avalanche. I just didn't really put it together that I liked Shadow Isle Freljord control because I was too focused on Anivia and not Feel the Rush. So like, I definitely understand where I missed FTR. And I think it was super smart of Shihu to bring that deck. Zoe Heimer. I don't know about that one, Chief. It ate so many bans that we never really got to see it in action, and then only had a 33% win rate. I don't know why this ate so many bans. Maybe I'm not gonna lie, I can't tell you half of the cards in this deck because it just like didn't play too often, and it had, you know, a very small sample size and a pretty poor win rate for that small sample size. But I did not think that this was the deck that players should have been banning in Shihu's lineup. So that one kind of threw me for a loop because it was banned in like half of, if not more than half of his games. So yeah, kind of wild on that one. I never would have put Zoe Heimer on the tier list. I'm not convinced this one was a good meta call. I don't really like. It's so hard to say if I hit or miss on this one, but that's that. And yeah, I think that's all the stuff I missed. So I hope you enjoyed me going over what I got right, what I got wrong. I think I got a lot more right than I got wrong. I missed FTR, but I understand where I missed FTR. I missed Shellfolk Ezreal. I to think that it's fine that I missed that one. I'll forgive myself on it, but yes, I did get that wrong. Draven Scion is something I need to dig into more. Bandle Tree's presence in the meta is something I need to dig into more, as well as Darkness Control. I was right to be skeptical of Nami Elusives. Overall, I'd give myself like a B+, maybe an A- in terms of like how I did in my predictions and things like that. My skill as an analyst going into the World Championship. But yeah, that's all I really wanted to do today, was like kind of go back and compare what I said to how things happen, and make some predictions for how these things are going to develop over the next 4 weeks before the seasonal. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm looking to do these after every big event. Hopefully I'll have a little bit more structure to it, but thank you so much for watching. My name is Boulevard. As always, good luck in your tournaments.